Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing the novel The Tree of Man written by Patrick White. Published in 1955, the novel is considered one of the most important works in Australian literature. Rather than focusing on heroic figures or dramatic historical events, White explores the lives of ordinary people. Through the story of a simple farming couple, the novel reflects on endurance, the passage of time, and the relationship between humans and nature. The novel is set mainly in the rural bushland of New South Wales near Sydney during a period that spans from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century. This was an important historical moment for Australia. The beginning of the story coincides with the Federation of Australia when the country was developing a strong national identity. Later events such as World War I and the rapid urbanization of the 1940s also shapes the social background of the novel. At the center of the story is Stan Parker, a quiet but physically strong man who arrives in the untouched bush with little more than an axe and a dog. Determined to build a life for himself, he begins clearing the land and slowly creates a farm. His difficult childhood, including the death of his alcoholic father and the emotional distance of his mother, shapes his silence and stubborn character. Eventually, he marries Amy Fibbens, whose personality contrasts with his own. Amy is anxious and imaginative, often worried about domestic security and emotional fulfillment. Together, they establish their farmstead called Duriglai and transforms the harsh wilderness into a home through years of physical labor. Throughout their lives, Stan and Amy face many challenges from the natural world. Floods, storms, and bushfires repeatedly threaten their farm. Stan responds to these disasters with calm acceptance, viewing them as mysterious forces of nature. Amy, however, reacts with fear and insecurity. During one bushfire, Stan performs an act of heroism by entering a burning house to rescue a young girl. Moments like this reveal his quiet strength and deep sense of responsibility towards others. The second generation of the Parker family shows the decline of the pioneer spirit. Their son, Ray, inherits his mother's restlessness but lacks his father's discipline. He becomes involved in gambling, crime, and reckless behavior, eventually dying in a violent pub fight. Their daughter, Thelma, represents a different kind of failure. Embarrassed by a rural background, she moves to the city, refines her manners, and marries a wealthy but emotionally distant man. Although she appears socially successful, her life is spiritually empty and disconnected from her roots. However, the novel ends with a small sense of hope through the third generation. Ray's unnamed son returns to the family farm after Stan's death and recognizes the beauty and meaning in the life his grandfather created. He begins to write poetry, suggesting that the experiences of the earlier generation can finally be expressed through art. Another important element of the novel is its setting. Dulgai begins as a vast and silent wilderness. Over time, the landscape changes as suburban development spreads into the area. Trees are replaced with roads, fences, and houses. This transformation reflects a large cultural shift in Australia from a life connected to the land towards a modern suburban society focused on material comfort. In conclusion, the Tree of Man shows that profound meaning can be found in ordinary lives through the experiences of Stan and Amy Parker. Patrick White suggests that human endurance, suffering, and quiet reflection are what truly gives life its significance.
Greetings everyone, this is Mirra. Now I'll be dealing with the themes in the novel The Tree of Man by Patrick White. So the first theme that we'll be dealing with is the struggle between man and nature. So at its core, the novel explores the strenuous relationship between the pioneer and the Australian wilderness. Stan Parker begins by clearing a patch of scrub to build a home, thereby representing the human desire to impose order on a chaotic language. However, nature is shown as a volatile force through floods, droughts, and fires in the novel. Thereby, White illustrates that while man can cultivate the land, he can never truly conquer it. The tree in the title symbolizes his rootedness, which is an attempt to stand firm against an environment that is both beautiful and indifferent. The next theme is inadequacy of language and communication. A recurring tragedy in the lives of Stan and Amy is the inability to truly know one another through words. Stan is a man of silences, finding his truth in physical labor and the natural world, whereas Amy often finds her emotional needs unmet by her husband's stoicism. White suggests that a language is a clumsy tool that often fails to capture the depths of human experience. This communion of silence highlights the isolation inherent in the human condition, where the most profound realizations usually happen internally and cannot be shared. The third theme is spiritual search for spiritual transcendence. Despite this being a story about a simple farmer, the novel is deeply mystical. Stan Parker is a natural man seeking a direct connection with the divine, bypassing traditional religious structures. His spiritual journey culminates in the famous scene where he realizes God is present even in a gob of spit on the grass. But it explores the idea that the extraordinary is hidden within the ordinary, that life in all its messy, repetitive, and mundane details is a sacred process of becoming. The fourth theme is the cycle of life and continuity. The novel follows the Parkers from the vigor of youth to the frailty of old age, emphasizing the cyclical nature of existence. As Stan and Amy's personal world expands and eventually contracts, the focus shifts to the children and grandchildren. The tree of man is ultimately the family tree, and the human race itself constantly shedding leaves but continuing to grow. The ending suggests that even as one man dies, his essence and struggle are absorbed into the ongoing flow of life, represented by his grandson's aspirations to be a poet. Next, we'll be looking at the symbols and motifs in the novel. So, the first symbol is the tree. The tree represents both the individual and the human race. Just as a tree is rooted in the earth but reaches towards the sky, Stan Parker is also grounded in labor while reaching for spiritual understanding. It also signifies permanence amidst change. While the Parkers age and eventually pass away, the tree of man continues to grow through new generations. Next, we'll be looking at the rose garden. Amy Parker's rose garden is a powerful motive for human desire and the attempt to cultivate beauty. Unlike the native scrub at Stanley's, the roses are delicate, demanding, and somewhat foreign to landscape. They also represent a longing for a more refined or romantic life beyond kitchen and the fields. The next theme will be motive that we'll be dealing with is for fire and water, these elements. The fire represents a raw, destructive passion and the unpredictability of the Australian bush, whereas the flood acts as a leveler that strips away social and status and material possessions, forcing the characters to face their naked selves. The gob of spit serves as a symbol of the divine disgusting. Stan realizes that God is not a distant golden figure in the sky, but is present in all matter, even the most lowly or repulsive. Animals and the natural man. Through the book, Stan is frequently compared to animals or described in relation to them. This motive emphasizes his role as a natural man, someone who exists in a state of being rather than in a state of talking. And then we look at the critical debates in the novel. The most famous debate in the novel is a 1955 review by poet and critic A.D. Hope. He called White's prose as pretentious and illiterate verbal sludge, arguing that White was trying to impose a European modernist complexity onto a simple Australian story where it didn't really belong. Whereas many critics like Leonie Kramer and Vincent Buckley debated whether White's sacramental realism was an authentic representation of the Australian experience. But many modern scholars also argue that White was the first to capture a spiritual vacuum of the Australian bush, whereas in the 21st century, the focus has shifted towards eco psychology and post colonialism in the novel. Now, the characters' identities are literally considered to be rooted in the ecology of the bush by many critics, seeing the novel as an early explanation of the deep, often traumatic bond between the settlers and a land they don't fully understand. Today, the novel is widely accepted not just as an Australian classic but as a world epic comparable to the works of Tolstoy or Faulkner for its ability to find the divine in the dirt. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I'm Rajathi, and I'm going to talk about Kate Greenwell's The Secret River. Whose land? Whose power? Whose violence? The land is empty. Empty or emptied? In The Secret River, land is not just soil, it is power, it is ownership, it is survival, and it is soaked in violence. Today, I will explore how violence, land, and power are deeply connected in Kate Greenwell's The Secret River. I'm going to talk about land. Land, which is more than property. For William Thornhill, land means freedom, social mobility, and escape from poverty. But for the Aboriginal people, land is identity, land is ancestry, land is sacred. For the colonizers, land is property, but for the natives, land is life. Land becomes the root cause of conflict over here. I'm going to talk about violence, which is visible and invisible. The first one is physical violence. The major impact revolves around the attacks on Aboriginal people. The next one is massacre at the end. The second kind of violence is psychological violence, which is fear, suspicion, and dehumanization. And the third, structural violence, which is all about colonial system, legal ownership, which is imposed by the British law. It begins with the word mine. Violence in the novel doesn't begin just with guns. Next, let me just talk about power. What is power and who has it? Power, power of guns, power, power of law, power of naming land, power of silence. Thornhill gains land, whereas he gains status, which leads to gains authority. But what does he lose? His moral innocence. To gain power, Thornhill must participate in violence. To own land, he must disown humanity. That contrast will strongly attract. And towards the end, what I'm going to say is that desire creates conflict creates violence, and violence creates power. In the secret river, the land creates desire. The river flows silently, but the history remembers. Thank you.
Good day everyone, I am Raveena and I am going to talk about fear as the driving force of conflict in the novel The Secret River by Kate Greenaway. This novel explores the early days of colonial Australia and focuses on the William Thornhills, a poor man from London who was transported to Australia as a convict. When he arrives there, he hopes to build a better life for himself and his family. The land near the river represents the opportunity of freedom and security for him. However, the novel shows that the conflict between the British settlers and Aboriginal people are not only caused by hatred. Instead, the author suggests that the fear of the main reason behind the violence that develops between two groups. From the beginning, fear strongly shapes Thornhill's character. Because he grew up in extreme poverty in London, he is deeply afraid of returning to a life of hunger and powerlessness. When he arrives in the Australia and gains access to land, he becomes very protective of it. But the presence of Aboriginal people on the land makes him insecure because he fears losing that he has worked so hard to gain. Another important cause of conflict in the novel is cultural misunderstanding. The settlers and the Durag people have completely different views about land. For the British settlers, land is something that can owned, fenced and controlled. But for the Aboriginal people, land is shared, spiritual and cannot truly belong to one people. Because neither group fully understand the other side beliefs, suspicious and tension begins to grow. Fear also spreads among settlers as a collective emotion. Rumors and stories, attacks create panic in the settlement. Some characters like Sylvian openly encourage violence and convince others that the force is the only way to survive. Gradually, fear turns into aggression, and settlers begin to justify violence as a way of protecting themselves. This tension finally leads to a tragic near the end of the novel. Thornhills take part in his violence not because he is naturally cruel, but because he feels trapped between protecting his family and doing what is morally right. Even though he eventually gains the land and status he is left with deep guilt and emotional emptiness. In conclusion, the novel shows that the conflict between settlers and Aboriginal people was driven not just by hatred but by fear, misunderstanding, and insecurity. Through Thornhill's story, the author reminds us how easily fear can push ordinary people to commit terrible action. Thank you.